Good morning, Secretary Browne. I want to revisit a legislative issue you and I worked on under the previous administration dealing with hybrid employment for Pennsylvanians who work for employers, at least in my district, south of the Mason-Dixon line. Because the employer has no physical presence in Pennsylvania, the employees are unable to work from home without triggering that state's corporate net income tax. So during the pandemic, if there was an employee who was working from home temporarily, the department did not consider that as a change to the sourcing of the employer's, or rather the employee's compensation. Then in 2021, the department revised its guidance, basically forcing any Pennsylvania resident who works across our state border to return to all in-person work or trigger nexus issues. Unfortunately, we were not able to permanently codify the common sense tax reform last session with opposition from the previous administration. I'm hoping that I can have your commitment to work on this matter as I continue to hear from local residents who would like to have that option to work from home less than 50% of the year without triggering CNIT nexus issues.
Thank you, Senator, and that's something that is, in terms of transition from the pandemic, something that's definitely something we have to take a serious look at in relation to what has been and what continues to be the basic definition of nexus of a company. And this is something the pandemic obviously affected because people needed to be at home and otherwise would not have nexus for the company in Pennsylvania because they're working out of state. But for a long time, the definition of nexus of a company was based on physical presence. It was based on property that you owned there or employees that you had there. And if a company has employees in Pennsylvania, the general rule, and it has been for a long time, it creates a nexus situation for that company. The pandemic obviously made an exception to that rule because people were, otherwise they would be working in the office. They were essentially forced to work at home. Something that is worth for us to continue to work on. The challenge will be that it counters, even more so now than in the past, since we have an economic nexus standard that's just based on sales, not on personnel or payroll. It will counter a general rule that's been in place for a long time. So we'll have to look at how that affects the entire nexus definition for companies in Pennsylvania. Amy, do you have anything to follow up on that with? Essentially what the challenge is.
Yeah, I agree. We do have an economic nexus standard that's been very successful since we put out a bulletin in 2020, and then also it was codified last year by the General Assembly. So it would have to be looked at in conjunction with that economic nexus.
And economic nexus is the strictest standard we had for nexus during my entire length of service. And it's important that it's pointed out that this is something we believe is consistent with the way we calculate corporate net income tax, because it's purely a sales factor apportionment now. For years we had property and payroll and that. To have the nexus based on someone's activity here in sales consistent with how we calculate it makes sense. When we're talking about people, the general rule has always been that creates nexus, so we'll have to work through some of these things.
I certainly hope that we can continue to work on that together.
Thank you.
It really means a lot in terms of a vast number of folks who call Pennsylvania home, and we want them to continue to call Pennsylvania home.
If I may just add just one additional thing, I'm hopeful that for companies that have tried to achieve and try to stay away from nexus in Pennsylvania for a very good reason for a very long time, and that it was the fact our corporate net income tax was 9.99%. And now that it drops to 4.99, the reason for a company not to be located here or nexus here, because of our economic nexus standard, I think we expanded the number of corporate filings in Pennsylvania by 2,100 filings, and that's important in relation to our overall base. But the discouragement that high rate did for years, hopefully that becomes less so, hopefully.
I agree. Thank you. If I may, your department has about $50 million in unused prior year funds. looking at $21.9 million for fiscal year 2020, 2021, and then $28.3 million from fiscal year 21, 22. That $50 million does not include $21.5 million of unused prior year funding from fiscal year 2019, 2020, which it seems you're giving back to the general fund. So that $50 million represents a reserve level of approximately 35%. Is it necessary to hold on to that much funding?
Well, as of over the last several years, in order to accommodate the partnership that this assembly had with the Department of Revenue and the rest of the administration in regards to the technology expansion we had, the waiver funds have been used as a means to accommodate that investment. There was an appropriate amount, the $4 or $5 million. The rest of the cost year over year, which is in the mid-20s, the waiver funds were used in order to pay for that. They came from our vacancies.
So you've asked for an additional, I think, $22.1 million for your cybersecurity information technology upgrades for this year, but it appears that, on average, you have about $20 million excess a year in each of those prior years. So does that mean that you don't need an additional $20 million for those IT upgrades? Are you able to give back $20 million into your budget request?
The actual costs that we're projecting for the technology upgrades, which is a contract of $145 million over that 10 years, is $27 million for the year. In prior years, the accounting for this did not include putting those waiver funds in the appropriation. This year, the Governor's Budget Office decided to book them as part of the appropriation, which at that higher level, in total cost, it more matches the cost of the technology investment that's going to be made for this year. Our projection isn't the original appropriation of around $5 million. It's the $5 million plus the waive funds. In order to get us through this entire technology upgrading period, and to pay for that $145 million, the waiver funds have been used in order to do that. So it's part of that overall budget.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, if I may, I hope that someone will dive into those technology funds and what they've been used for, because this upgrade has been going on for quite some time. So I thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.